Welcome along, Rob Staton and Jeff Simmons here to discuss some big Seahawks topics, and it feels like there's quite a lot to get into. Jeff, always good to have you on the stream. So, I mean, before we sort of get into the meatier topic that I wanted to discuss today, I just wanted to maybe start off with you sort of giving us an opinion on where you think the Seahawks are. So they had a decent start, but in the last 5 games they've won one. And that could be 1-5 easily by Christmas Eve, given that they're going to the Kansas City Chiefs. So how do you feel about this team?
It's the team that's right now the definition of in the middle, mediocrity. A team that's not bad enough to be in the bottom picks, although they might get one. And as we've seen over the last month, it's not nearly good enough. And it's strange. In October, well, every time me and you have talked this year, they've taken radical changes. And if you when we talked in October, like this was one of the more likable Seahawks teams I can remember. Just everything we went through with Pete and Russell the last few years after the Legion of Boom era, and the way they just exceeded expectations. And over the last 5 games or 6 games, they've gone the exact opposite way. They're now become one of the least likable Seahawks teams I can imagine. And there's still some good things going on, and it's still big picture. They're in a decent spot moving forward. But when you're so bad on defense and you're so bad at just the basic level of stopping the run, and when you can't do a lot of the basic things this team wants to do, and one of the things I learned early about the NFL is you don't really learn about a team until after Thanksgiving in America. And since Thanksgiving, the Seahawks have been one of the least enjoyable teams to watch. They've been gutless. And last game was I had such low expectations. I thought it was going to be a 38-3 game. The fact that they didn't get killed, I wasn't miserable. And that surprised me. And if that's a mentality going into a game, that's just bad. Like, it's not enjoyable to watch the team. They're still in a playoff race, but it's almost a point of dread right now. And that's a really sad and unfortunate turn from where they were in October. And right now they're just a gutless team that's really, really hard to root for. And they have a lot of work to do.
If you want to get a super chat in and join in the discussion, or if you have a question for Jeff, or just want to make a general point or a statement, then super chat is the pathway to do that. I wanted to start by talking about Pete Carroll, Jeff.
Yeah.
Because I don't think this has been widely discussed. I think it should be, and I want to have that conversation with you. I think we can have a good conversation about it. And I'm sure there'll be a variety of views on us having this conversation, and some people will say it's just mindless speculation, and others will say, maybe lessons should be learned about the Russell Wilson trade that was, completely it's never going to happen in a million years, and here we are, several months on now, and it did happen. So a week ago, Benjamin Albright, who is a reporter he works for the flagship radio station for the Denver Broncos, which in itself might lead to some people thinking, well, is there some kind of, I don't know, is that a connection that we should be wary of? I don't know. But either way, he tweeted about coaching changes, and he predicted that there will be 7 changes at the end of the season. So he named Carolina and Indianapolis because they've already fired their coaches. And then he listed a collection of teams that might do it as well. Broncos, Texans, Chargers, Commanders, Cardinals, Saints, Bucks. And then he said, even potentially the Rams and the Seahawks all could be looking for new head coaches for a variety of reasons. So that was the original tweet. He later expanded on that when he was challenged about the Rams and Seahawks aspect of that tweet. And he said that with the Seahawks, it could be down to a possible retirement, that Pete Carroll could retire. That was how this all started. Joe Fan, who will be, Seahawks fans will be very familiar with, then a couple of days later tweeted out a thought that he wouldn't be entirely surprised if Carroll called it a day at the end of the season. And I joined in that conversation and said, look, I think it might be best for all parties. You can make an argument for that. And then I was contacted by someone in the NFL who said that, there is some talk within the league about this being a possibility. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it is at least a conversation. And it kind of somewhat validated what Benjamin Albright was sort of tweeting about. So take that for what it's worth. I am not a reporter. I am simply adding to what is being talked about out there. If you were to ask me, do I want to put some money on Pete Carroll retiring? My answer will be no. But there is some chatter out there. And then Benjamin Albright saw the tweet from Joe Fan, and I'm going to share this tweet just so that people can see it. This is what he said. Been talking about this for a couple of weeks. Wouldn't be surprised if John Gannon, the Philadelphia Eagles defensive coordinator, became the top name in the search if Carroll were to be done. So he shares that. That's his initial sort of. He adds to it, and then when he was challenged on that again, or to further sort of discuss that point, he then posted this tweet. I think the GM there, John Schneider, has wanted someone else as a head coach for some time now, even if they won't publicly acknowledge that. So those were the two tweets that kind of caught my eye a little bit, and I thought, okay, this goes beyond, hey, Pete Carroll might retire. This is starting to get into some specifics here. Now, again, it's pretty hot speculation, Jeff. We've kind of been here before with the Seahawks when it comes to hot speculation with Russell Wilson. There are mixed opinions on Benjamin Albright, but he has, in fairness, showed himself to be somewhat connected to people in the NFL and isn't one who has posted a lot of inaccurate information, let's say, over the years. So I've got some other things to say about this, but I just want to leave that with you for now. What do you make of all this?
I don't think it's far-fetched at all. And listen, Ben is not a traditional newsbreaker, but he does have some sources around the league. He's one of these guys who pats himself on the back when he gets a scoop right, so it's not the best sign of someone who looks at that, but he does have connections to the Russell Wilson camp. He does get a lot of things right, and the way he goes about it, you can question, but yeah, he's not a guy who just throws stuff out there and like some other guys do. And I think it should be taken. And listen, this shouldn't be a shock to anyone, even if it's true. The Schneider stuff is interesting because we know how close that they appear to be, but I bet you a lot of the stuff that Ben had heard had been related to Russell because John wanted to move on. And John was the one who was dealing with Mark Rodgers. He was the one who thought that Russell's contract and all of the stuff they wanted, Josh Allen and Mahomes. And Pete was, oddly enough, Pete was Russell's biggest defender. And Pete nixed. I know, Rob, you were very big on this when it happened. You were all over that. Pete nixed that trade with Chicago that I think John wanted to do. And so John's probably sitting there. And yeah, after a while where you're starting to see they had the years of bad drafting and they finally hit the draft this year. And I'm sure all these years of bad drafting, and he wants to get rid of Russell. He sees an uneven roster. He sees a limited roster. And if I'm him, you got to be thinking, and some of Pete's coaches have led to some of the bad picks. There was all those Tom Cable things. And I know some people who worked there who was DM me before and said, I tweeted about Tom Cable, and listen, I'm not a inside reporter anymore, but he said what you're saying is true. And I'm sure John's never hired a head coach in the NFL. Pete hired him. Pete was already hired when he had his interviews. So if you're John and Schneider and you have all these picks coming up, a part of you has to be wondering, can I make this my team? Can I have my coach? And I don't know about his connections to John Gannon. Obviously, he worked with Dan Quinn as well. And we can talk about some other names. But if you're a general manager and you've never hired a head coach in the NFL, that's got to, especially with this mountain of draft capital, and we're seeing the same themes over and over now. And listen, Pete, a month ago, I bet looking at this roster and where it was, he's probably thinking, okay, we're a couple players away from being a Super Bowl team. And over this last month, the reality is hit. And he's 71 years old, and they're not close. They have to rebuild basically the entire defense, and they have questions who the quarterback's going to be. If you're Pete, well, I know we talked about it in 2017 after the Legion of Boom thing there was a report that year that Pete was considering retiring, and Sean McVay stuff is absolutely true. So I'm watching very closely to Sundays and I think Saturday this week, or whenever there's those pregame shows, a lot of the top reporters come out with their big swing. Last year when Sean Payton decided to walk away, that caught everyone by surprise. And it was a similar thing. He saw a roster that had no ceiling. and he walked away. And I don't think Pete has no ceiling with all his draft capital, but 71 years old, this team is not – you look at them in San Francisco last week, the gap is rather large in quality, and he's had a great career. This year has kind of rebuilt his reputation. It's rebuilt his image, even though they might go winless to end the year in 1-7 down the stretch. But the way this Russell Pete thing ended, it would be a very good, logical time to walk away.
Yeah, the timing would be good. I've got a couple of other things that I want to put to you as well, and I will warn you in advance now, Jeff. This is speculation, but I'm going to throw it your way. I think it's interesting. I just want to get this super chat out there, Mike. Please, God, let it be over, says Mike on the super chat there. If you want to make a comment, then please do send those super chats in. Right, I want to take it a step further based on what we're discussing. Pete Carroll, for me, there is a lot of coach speak, as there is with all coaches, but he isn't the hardest man to read. And I think some of his language and his body language recently has been quite telling. So after the 49ers game, he became very emotional, talking about Tyler Lockett's somewhat minor hand injury. I mean, he's going to miss one game by all accounts, but Carroll was talking about him like he'd had a career-threatening knee injury. And I thought that's strange, because first I thought, well, is this just because he thinks it's going to have a huge impact on their chances of getting to the playoffs? But then as I was kind of listening to it further, I thought, this isn't typical, this. And I do wonder a little bit whether that was Carroll unintentionally revealing that he was fearing that he might have coached his last game with Lockett, who has been one of his favourite players in Seattle. He has at a few times, Jeff, called Lockett the ideal Seahawk. The definition of what he considers to be a Seahawk for his character, his personality, his work rate, and his talent. So I think what he said and the way he said it had more meaning for perhaps this was Carroll getting quite upset that he was thinking, that's it. I'm never going to coach Tyler Lockett again. So that's me reading into it. Admittedly, might be completely wide of the mark there, but that was my thought. And then in the same press conference, there was this slightly unusual revealing by Carroll that he'd prepared a speech to congratulate the team had they beaten San Francisco, talking about how proud he was of them and that they deserved that moment of beating San Francisco in a big divisional game. And he said he was really upset that he hadn't been able to give that speech and kind of shrugged at the end and went, maybe next week. And it's just not something you hear a coach say very often. And it made me think again that maybe this was a man embracing the end and he was kind of wanting to cherish every moment, that he was desperate to give that speech to this group that he likes. And then not beating San Fran it sort of robbed him of that opportunity, and he was feeling a bit, and he sort of gave that nugget out there. Again, it's not something he would typically say. There was also this, Jeff. It was revealed via Greg Bell on Twitter that Carroll had bought all of the regular media members a pair of Air Monarchs as a gift. And the group had come together and decided they were all going to wear the Air Monarchs on the same day as a tribute to Carroll. And that all felt very symbolic, almost like they know. And, the coach giving a gift to look. I mean, I've been in the media and it's not often that you get given a gift by the coach. And if coach has been there 13 years and is coming to the end, and there's been some of these media members have been there throughout the 13 years or the bulk of it, it felt symbolic that he was giving them a gift and that they actively they didn't just go, oh, cheers, Pete, and, took them away, but they all wore them on the same day. And then it got out publicly that they'd done that. That, again, felt like there's something going on here. And you mentioned it. He nearly retired at the end of the 2017 season. We know that he hasn't been able to recreate the magic since that 2018 reset. The team has struggled to put together a good defense, a good running game. They haven't been able to bring the Carroll vision to life. He's 72. Naturally, he's towards the end of his career anyway. He must surely realise this is a bigger rebuild than perhaps his current contract, which runs to 2025, will allow. And if he parts now, that new coach gets the benefit of the draft haul coming up next year to shape a new vision. So I could easily be reading too much into that. And based on the tweets I get, Jeff, this week, questioning how long I followed the Seahawks for and telling me there is nobody else who could possibly do this job other than Pete Carroll, I'm sure there will be some pushback to this. Am I reading too much into it, or are all those points worth highlighting?
I thought the last point especially was really interesting, and I saw that happen. I didn't put one on one together, and yeah, that's a really good. You might be on something here. There might be some detective work there. That is definitely. I've been in media before. That is uncommon. That is something that doesn't happen. I don't think it's just something that's happening with age. There might be something there, and the speech thing is a really good point as well. But like, I know people are probably coming at you and going after you. Like, if you would have said at this time last year that Sean Payton is going to walk away from the Saints, people would have called you absolutely crazy. And no one talked about that at this time last year. And one day, I think Jay Glazer drops that news, and it just happens. And I think there are signs, and I don't think you're reading too deep into it at all. Even Pete was on his usual 710 interview, and even the way he was, I think KJ Wright or Brock Heward was asking him about next year and how they kind of build everything back up, and he didn't seem to have that usual enthusiasm that if I had a top 5 pick coming and maybe 2 top 14 picks, I'd be pretty jacked up. Like, they could really reshape this team pretty fast, and he didn't seem to have that enthusiasm. And listen, it would be a perfect time. The timing of it would just make a lot of sense for him. He'd go out kind of setting the next guy up. I don't know a ton about John Gannon's head coaching name, but I don't want to focus much on that now. But yeah, I think there's a lot of validity there. If you're him, you're 71 years old. You've had a great career, Hall of Fame, borderline Hall of Fame. And if this just keeps happening where the team just can't play in his style, I just don't think he's going to have fun. And you watch San Francisco again, like San Francisco's the Super Bowl team. You see the gap in quality. I don't know if he's just going to want to go through all this with young guys. And they've seen this year they made a scheme change, and frankly, it hasn't worked. And I don't know if they want to continue with this or they want to kind of start from scratch. So, yeah, I think a lot of things you said, it's definitely worth watching. And until we hear he's 100% coming back, I think listening to press conferences these next 3 weeks are really going to be important. I think listening to national reporters who are going to have their big stories over the next 3 weeks is going to be really important. And then, yeah, if this team goes 1-7, which I think is a very strong possibility down the stretch, like that's got to weigh on the guys. So I think there's a ton of validity there.
Could you? We're getting a few comments that there's a bit of an echo, Jeff. I think it's your volume. So could you mute when I'm talking? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
I think cool. There we go. It's sorted itself out. I think that. I mean, I almost get to the point, Jeff, where I don't know whether Pete Carroll, if he is contemplating this, and why wouldn't he? Because we've already talked about the 2017 thing. I suspect it's probably not the first time where he's thought, do I really want to do this anymore? He may well have that conversation every year with himself or his wife or his people closest to it. I think it would be it makes a lot of sense to have that conversation now. And people have been saying, well, because of the draft haul, then you know, why would you walk away from that? But it's about more than that. It's about, you know, do you genuinely believe, you know, that we're talking years and years now. It's going to be a decade since the Super Bowl season. And they've had 2 sort of, you know, they've had the reset in 2018. They couldn't build a contender. They've had quite a messy divorce from Russell Wilson. And now if they go through this rebuild and they don't get it right, or if Pete Carroll's thinking, do you know what, I could possibly do this for another year or 2, but I can't do this for 5 to 6 to 7 years. And therefore it's not right for me to sort of be in charge when we have this draft class next year, because if I'm not going to see this through, and I'm going to walk away halfway through the project, it's just, and he's 72. You know, how much longer realistically does he want to do this? And I just wonder whether or not the second half of this season's weighing down on him. Now, if they beat the Chiefs on Christmas Eve, then you know, maybe he suddenly has a U-turn on that and thinks differently. I don't. I think if they lose to the Chiefs, and then, you know, I think it perfectly sets it up really for the last 2 games. He plays his old team, the Jets and the Rams, and you know, wouldn't it be nice to sort of have some kind of an announcement ahead of that Rams game? Go out there, Carroll get one last win for the road against the Rams, a division rival, to finish on a high and have his homegrown moment when, you know, when they beat the Jets in 2008, and have that kind of a moment. That would be nice for Pete Carroll. and then move on, and then we sort of get to sort of see a new era, which for me, Jeff, I'm ready to see. I'm ready to see it. And I'm look, whenever you sort of say that, people get very, very defensive, because what you've got to remember, Jeff, is there are people who've started following the Seahawks since 2010. You know, they've grown up with Pete Carroll as the head coach, and they don't know anything else other than Pete Carroll, Seattle Seahawks. They get very defensive of any suggestion that Pete Carroll shouldn't be the coach. But 13 seasons is a long time. And I've just not seen anything schematically that makes me think this defense, and he is a defensive-minded head coach, is going to get back to the top. And I don't want, and I really don't think just having a load of draft picks is going to solve this. I'm ready to see some fresh ideas, a new voice. I embrace the possibility of it going badly with a new coach, but I'm ready to give that a try. I'm ready to see something else. And other teams have done that and had success. You know, the Eagles have gone from Doug Peterson winning a Super Bowl to just plucking some random guy who couldn't even do a bloody interview for, you know, from the Indianapolis Colts, and he's got them to 13-1. So embrace it and go with a fresh start. I'm ready for that, Jeff. Are you ready for that, or are you more? Because a lot of people will say, look, they've, you know, look how Geno's played. You know, look how they were playing earlier in the season. Tariq Woolen, don't throw that away. But I don't really think there's that much to salvage at this point.
Yeah, I'm sort of with you there. I think I've learned a lot about Pete and my perception of him. And there are a lot of things that I accounted for him that have carried over to Russell Wilson in Denver. So there are a lot of things, just like the way they came out of the huddle and how they haven't had the same sort of problems, and seeing Russell do a lot of the things that I always thought were Pete issues carry into Denver and completely evaporate with Geno. I've learned a lot about Pete as a head coach, but I think overall, I'm with you. It's been 13 years, and this happens. Like you're seeing with Bill Belichick now in New England, where they don't have the talented team. They don't Tom Brady anymore. They don't have the dominant. They have a good defense, but not much else. There's chatter of him leaving New England, and there's chatter of how good was he the whole time. And this is what happens. Like there's only so many like Andy Reid, Mahomes situations. And Andy Reid couldn't have been better in Philadelphia, and he got fired, had to leave there. This happens. There's nothing that gives a fan more of a shot in the arm than just a new coach and a new leader, and what they can do for a program, how they draft differently, how they sign free agents differently, how they hire coaches. Like I learned a lot about Pete Carroll. I was admittedly wrong about a bunch of the things that I probably would have blamed him for in the past, but I just think this team needs a shot in the arm, and it might be in the draft. Sure, I know that's going to help a lot because you just see the lack of blue chip talent on this team. But I think just overall, they sort of need a reset. And we've talked about it for so long, where there's just been this misalignment of how they want to play and the personnel they've brought in to play it. And we talked about how good the draft was this year, and that's great. But all the things me and you have talked about, Rob, in the past 4 years, they're still paying for those mistakes. And you see, like, where would this team be right now if you have 2 first-round picks and not Jamal Adams? Where is this team right? Like, who knows? You put Jordan Davis, who's, I was told for a fact he was the next guy on their board if Charles Cross was gone, and they had that next pick. You put Jordan Davis on their team. It's going to help with run stuffing. The year before, they gave up a first-round pick. They ended up spending a second-round pick on D. Eskridge. Like, if you, what I was told, they liked Elijah Moore, they liked Rondale Moore. If you put Elijah Moore and Jordan Davis on this team right now, they're a lot further. So we've just seen things that they're just playing a style, and for years there's just been this one-dimensional passing team. And if the coach can't get the team to play the way he wants, and if this was a traditional situation, and I don't think it is because of the ownership situation, I think because of the rebuild situation, the Russell situation, the play over the last month is the kind of thing that would get a coach fired. When your team falls off a cliff to that degree, and they're just the way they're going against what the coach stands for, in a traditional sense, that is the thing that gets the coach fired. And yeah, Pete's done really good things. Everyone talks about Pete as this like defensive mastermind, and frankly, I think that's wrong. I think what Pete does is he's more of a culture builder, and he's more of at USC when he had way more control over personnel with recruiting. They never had a great defense. They were offensive teams, and the team with Geno this year was a lot of how he played at USC, the way they were just so efficient on offense and the running and the passing. And they were never like a great defensive team like they were in the Legion of Boom. So the fact that they can't play to how he wants, to me, that's a sign of a head coach that is kind of dwindling. And it's not his fault. It's a lot of it's personnel. But for me, I just think fans at some point, they needed a shot in the arm. And that coaching change, like when Pete first got here after that Jim Moore year, like I was watching every press conference and I was fired up. And you just want to learn and you want to see something different. And yeah, you might miss, but like I think I'm at the point where I just need something new. And if we want it, it's fine. I know this team's going to be better with these picks, but we want the team back to where they're contending again, not just hoping to slide into the 7th seed. Maybe you play Minnesota and give them a tough game. We want them to be Super Bowl level. And I think it's hard to see that happening unless they absolutely crush drafts like they did at the beginning of 2012. One of the things about Pete that I think should be looked at is you look at like a San Francisco or some of the other staffs and how many good coaches they've hired and how many good assistants they've hired. In San Francisco, they have Robert Saleh and now D'Amico Ryans and Mike McDaniel. And you see all these coaches that are coming out of there. Mike LaFleur went to the Jets. You look at Seattle and Brian Schottenheimer's a quality control guy. Chris Richard's taken a step back. Ken Norton went back to college. Sean Desai hasn't worked out this year. Clint Hurtt struggled his first year. Shane Waldron's been good, but that was, from my understanding, more of a Russell decision. And I think that's a telling sign about the head coach and where things are in the program. And the fact that no one's even getting coaching interviews, there's been no good candidates. When you look at John Schneider's staff, there's been guys coming up the system and Scott Fitterer and Dan Morgan. And that's a sign of a good staff. And to me, I think that's a sign as much as everything of where how everything just stagnated.
Yeah, I think you make some good points there. And in terms of moving forward, I mean, I've watched a little bit of the Eagles recently. I must admit, I kept half an eye on them in the weekend, given what had been reported about Jonathan Gannon, and I don't know. I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by him. I'm intrigued by his defense. They've been sacks galore. I know they've got a good defensive line there in Philly, but I'd also suggest that they don't have a Bosa. They don't have somebody who just. If you could just mute again, Jeff, that'd be great. There is a lot of background noise again. If you could just take out there, great. D'Amico Ryans cannot bring Nick Bosa with him wherever he goes. That's the problem. Just as Brandon Staley couldn't take Aaron Donald to the LA Chargers, and that's what I'm suspicious of. I'm always suspicious of a defensive coordinator or an offensive coordinator for that matter, who's playing behind a coach who is leading the offense or the defense. What I want is, if you are going to appoint a coordinator, it should be somebody who, if it's a defensive coordinator, they're working for an offensive-minded head coach and they're controlling the defense. And preferably, they're getting something out of the group schematically. They're getting a lot out of the group rather than relying on just an incredible player, that you only get once a decade, which I think is what we're seeing with a Bosa and with an Aaron Donald and people like that. Just as I wouldn't necessarily sort of say, well, the Browns defensive coordinator is really good because Myles Garrett gets 15 sacks. It's like, well, no, Myles Garrett's a freak of nature. So that's why Jonathan Gannon intrigues me a little bit. Aggressive. I've listened to some of his interviews. I quite like him. He looks young and different. And I don't know. I'd be somewhat intrigued. And the positive with that is, if he comes in, there's a chance that, I guess, Shane Waldron carries on as offensive coordinator and you have that consistency there. And I'm not opposed to Shane Waldron staying, but I'm ready to move on from this Clint Hurtt, Sean Desai experiment. It's just not worked. The other candidates, Jeff, that I've written down here that could that people will talk about, I imagine. Dan Quinn, you've already mentioned, has done a very good job with the Cowboys and got a connection there to Seattle. I'm not sure whether I want to go back to people who've worked here before, though. I'm not sure. I would be interested in something different. People will say D'Amico Ryans. Frank Reich is available. I don't know if you can judge him based on what happened in Indianapolis this year, because look at it, it's a circus. And he was never really given much of a chance in terms of the quarterbacks, although I suppose at the same time he would have been a big influence on them trading for Carson Wentz, and that was a disaster. Shane Steichen is the offensive coordinator. at Philadelphia, and if memory serves, was even linked with the Seahawks offensive coordinator job when Shane Waldron got it. But has done a good job there. You know, do you put that down to the head coach, or do you put it down to Shane Steichen? I'm not sure. That's the tough one. Kellen Moore, you know, he's done a very good job with the Dallas offense. But again, some good weapons there. Brian Callahan will get praise for Cincy, but again, is he going to be able to bring Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, Joe Mixon with him? Not sure. But he has worked around a crap offensive line and had success. So, you know, there's some candidates there, Jeff. There's nobody in college that I would pine for. I think that you really, I think that's going to become less of a thing now off the back of what's happened with Urban Meyer and oh God, the guy in my memory is terrible. The guy who was at Carolina this year. I've completely forgotten his name. It's just gone to Nebraska. Yeah, with those two failures, expensive failures, I think that's going to become less of a route for teams now. So they're kind of the list. I don't think it's a terrible list. There's not, you know, there's not someone that really sort of jumps off the page and slaps you in the face with a wet fish and says, "Make me the head coach." But if you told me that Jonathan Gannon was the head coach of the Seahawks, you know, second week in January or whatever the Eagles get dumped out of the playoffs, if you were to tell me that they'd appointed Kellen Moore, D'Amico Ryans, Dan Quinn, I must admit, Jeff, I could imagine us being on a stream together and going and being able to sort of reason that away and go, yeah, okay, let's give this guy a chance. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting year because there are no like standout candidates. It's a lot of guys that we don't know. It's a lot of guys, and one of the biggest mistakes a lot of writers I see a national writer, a lot of fans make is they'll see a really good coordinator, and they'll say, okay, this guy's doing a great job as a coordinator. They're up for a promotion, and I understand the logic of that, but it's the biggest mistake that a lot of fans, a lot of experts, and you see it with like Peter Schrager. They say like, oh, Shane Waldron's coordinated great offense this year. Like if you listen to the guy talk, he doesn't strike me as like a leader of men. It's like someone who's like VP of sales now becoming a CEO. It's a totally different job. Obviously, a lot of the league has shifted towards offensive play callers because if you have a good defensive coach and their offensive coordinator is good, they might get hired. So a lot of the teams that have had success have been more stable. But what you're looking for really is someone who's they're modern, they can hire good coaches, and they're a leader of a team. And so that's where you see a guy like Brian Callahan or Shane Waldron, who's had a good year. Brian Callahan's Bill Callahan's son, who used to be head coach of the Raiders. He's been around. He's been a really good offensive line coach, so he's got the bloodlines in there. But what you're looking for is like a really, really good leader, someone who's connected around the league. So there are some interesting names. I'm like you. I can see the tie between Dan Quinn and Pete Carroll. I mean, John Schneider. They've worked together. He's tough. He's done a really good job like rebranding himself. But to me, I don't want to see someone who's been part of the Carroll tree. I want to see someone a little different. So in an ideal sense, they would be able to hire more of an offensive head coach. Just it's like when you're sort of dating in life, you want to be someone who you want your next person to be someone who's been completely different than your last person. So I would understand that philosophy, but like you look around the league and it's all these guys on teams that have elite quarterbacks like Brian Callahan and Ken Dorsey and Eric Bieniemy struggled to get a job over the years. Shane Steichen and San Francisco's Kyle Shanahan calling the plays. And you look around, and what you don't want to do is you don't want to do what Denver did and say, oh, Green Bay had a good offense last year. Let's hire their coordinator. He's a nice guy. Like, he came out well in the interview, and he's been an absolute train wreck. Nathaniel Hackett. What you want to do is try to avoid finding the next Nathaniel Hackett. And, like, you look at last year, Brian Daboll from Buffalo, he became the Giants coach. Like, he was a home run. Like, he was the guy who I would have been really, really high on had he hit the market. But Josh McDaniels, who's been a really good coordinator over the years, he's struggling again with situational management. So there's going to be a lot of names, and there's going to be a lot of names to learn. But Frank Reich, I think, is a really, really good head coach. And I think Frank Reich was put – and he was part of it. You mentioned Carson Wentz. He would be a guy who would be high on my list. I think he's a really good play caller. I think he's a guy when he had a good quarterback with Andrew Luck, that team was going really, really well. And even with Phillip Rivers a couple of years ago, they were a really good team. They were aggressive on fourth down. They drafted really well. He's a natural leader. He was a quarterback in the NFL. He's a guy I would be really interested in. John Gannon's a guy who's considered sort of a rising star. He actually came from Frank Reich's staff in Indianapolis, and they've done a good job with their coaches. They hired him. They hired Nick Sirianni. And Gannon's a guy who's been like he's bumped around different leagues, and he is considered to be like a leader type. So and the thing that's different about him is like he's not like a defensive guru. He's more of like a big picture kind of thinker. And last year he was kind of criticized at first in Philly, but this year they got better players, and you saw their defense. D'Amico Ryan's another one where I don't know what he's like schematically because you see how good Nick Bosa is, and you see how good their linebackers are. When you have that front with those linebackers, it's really easy to call defense. But D'Amico Ryans was like a leader in the NFL. He was every team he was on, he was the captain. He is a guy who could lead a locker room, and he's a guy who has a ton of respect. So he's a guy that would intrigue me. I think he's a guy who can definitely take over an interview. When he was with the Texans and I think the Ravens later, like he was just I think it was the Eagles, not the Ravens. Just he was a guy that took over a locker room, and I don't know his connections around the league, but he's been really really impressive. But there's a lot of names that are going to be interesting, and you see some of the names. Another guy who's getting some steam is the coordinator in Detroit, Ben Johnson. He's a guy that Detroit has emerged with Jared Goff as one of the more complete offenses. He was like a tight end coach there last year. They promoted him when they fired Anthony Lynn midseason, and they've now become one of the better offenses in the league. I don't know what his personality is like. He's someone I'm going to want to dive a little deeper into once the coaching cycle happens, but there's a lot of names. There's not a lot of sure things. Like Sean Payton is out there and he wants to get back in coaching. He would have to give up a draft pick since New Orleans still controls his rights. But I don't know if this is the situation he would end up in, given like I don't know if he wants a Geno or unless he wants to draft a CJ Stroud. And if he wants to draft a Will Levis or CJ Stroud, maybe that's appealing. But I see that as more of a long shot.
It's interesting. It is interesting, and even just listening to you talk about the names, Jeff, it creates some appeal for me. And you just wonder, Frank Reich is someone who really intrigues me, and I wonder where he's at. Will he want to immediately go back into a head coaching role? Would he be open to being a coordinator for a year and then going back to being a head coach? Would the Seahawks be open to having, a 1-year offensive coordinator, knowing he's probably going to go off again? But could, Gannon and Reich as a duo, potentially if they've worked together, could that be a good move? I don't know. We've seen Dan Quinn go from a head coach for a number of years, then go into a coordinator's job and completely rebuild his sort of standing. Would Frank Reich be interested in that? Maybe, as Gannon's offensive coordinator. But if you were to tell me that like those two could work together in Seattle next year, I'd be down for a bit of that. So we'll see. I'm interested by that. Jack on the Super Chat says, would love to see Dan Quinn come back and be a head coach for us. If not him, then a young offensive mind. Having a McDaniel, Daboll, O'Connell-like coach with a shot in the arm, we could really use. I always think if you are going to have a young quarterback for a number of years, it's best to have an offensive-minded head coach because then you're not likely to lose. Well, you're not going to lose them. If you have a young quarterback and then he does really well with an offensive coordinator, they will get another job and you will have to then replace them. That's really difficult. So if Seattle's like thinking, right, we're going to draft a quarterback at number 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, then you're probably best going for an offensive-minded head coach. If you're sticking with Geno Smith and drafting defense, then do what you want. I think that'd be quite interesting. If you are going to appoint Gannon and then saying, right, you've now got 5 picks in the first 3 rounds, let's spend 3 or 4 of them on the defense. Maybe even all 5 on the defense. Build a new defense. That would be fantastic. Very exciting. Right, I wanted to ask you about the draft position and the playoff scenarios, Jeff. We'll start with the draft. So obviously the Seahawks at the moment are picking 3rd overall, courtesy of Denver. Chicago back to number 2. But there's teams like Arizona, Indianapolis, who could get ahead of Seattle, depending on what happens over the last 3 games. Denver play the Rams on Christmas Day. I think Seahawks fans will be the only people watching that game because of the draft position. I don't even think there's some Rams and Broncos fans who will bother watching it. But Seahawks fans will probably be watching it. I certainly will for that reason. They then go to the Chiefs, which I'm going to chalk down as a loss, even though the Chiefs seem to be playing every game maddeningly close at the minute. And then they play the Chargers. And the Chargers may need to win that game to get in the playoffs because they are right in the wild card mix. So, when I think about it, Jeff, I can see Denver winning one more game, potentially against the Rams. but that might be it. I don't anticipate them beating the Chiefs and the Chargers. And certainly if Justin Herbert's on it, you would expect them to beat Denver in that last game, although that is a mile high. Arizona, Trace McSorley starting this weekend. They play the Bucks at home. You never quite know what you're going to get from them. They go to the Falcons, who are strangely still in the playoff race because the NFC South is a disaster. And then they get to the San Francisco 49ers, who, that is going to be a loss. It's just, I guess, if they're already in the playoffs, the Niners, if their seeding position is secure, and if they're not the number one seed because the Eagles have got it, why would you play Nick Bosa and co? So there's always a chance that they could be playing the backups in that game. But there's a distinct possibility there that Arizona will not win a game and will lose out. And then it'll come down to strength of schedule as to who, if the Broncos win a game, who finishes higher in the draft. And then Chicago play the Bills at home this weekend. Chicago play every game close, but then find a way to lose at the end. The Lions, they go to the Lions on the road, and then they host the Vikings, and the Vikings might be in the same situation as San Francisco, might essentially use that as a de facto bye, but there's a chance Chicago will lose out and secure the second overall pick. And then you've got the Colts, who've got the tie, which is, going to work against them in draft position. Chargers at home, Giants on the road, Texans at home. So they could win the Texans game, although I from their point of view, I would imagine there's a decent chance they will just fall like a pack of cards now after that loss to Minnesota. And they've changed quarterback again. Now Nick Foles is getting a go this weekend. And then for the Seahawks, Chiefs on the road, Jets at home, Rams at home. That's Seattle. Obviously, their draft position is not going to matter, is it? Because they're not the team picking third overall. But it could get them, if they were to lose all of those games, they're going to be in the top 12. If they win a couple, they might end up in the playoffs. So from the draft position, if you would, with all that information on who the teams are playing, Jeff, where do you think the Seahawks are going to end up picking? Because my guess, I think there's a distinct possibility that Arizona might just sneak in there with the number 3 pick, and it leaves Seattle at number 4.
Yeah, right now my gut feeling is number 4, and this Denver Rams game is really important if they want to end up as 2 or 3 pick. Russell Wilson's coming back. Denver's defense has been pretty good all season, and the Rams returned back to their terrible play again this week. But a sneaky thing with the Rams thing is the Rams played the Seahawks last week of the year, and Bobby Wagner's returned to Seattle. Aaron Donald might be back. We saw how close that game was in LA. Rams could win that game. So there's a lot of focus on this game coming up. But the Rams could make up a win later. The problem is, as you said, Arizona is now the sneaky bad team. They're on to their third-string quarterback. They have a lower strength of schedule than a lot of the teams they're competing with. But it's now Seattle has to basically tie Arizona, or else Denver has to tie Arizona, or else Arizona's going to pass them. So I think 4 is realistic. But if Denver loses this game, they're likely going 0-3 because the Chiefs have to beat them. They're at Arrowhead, and Buffalo plays Cincinnati that week. So that game could be a number 1 seed implication game. So KC's going to be very motivated to win, and the Chargers are going to be in a playoff situation. And that game is in Denver, which the Chargers are capable of losing any game. So Indianapolis has Houston. So I don't know if they're going to pass Seattle, even though they are going to Nick Foles, and their coach, Jeff Saturday, clearly is going to be a short-term situation. But, yeah, right now it's hard not to think Denver's going to beat the Rams, which bumps Seattle out of probably the top 2 or 3. It's crazy with Chicago, too. Chicago, in this Justin Fields whole run where he's played damn well and they've lost 5 games by 5 points or less. And if they just won one of those games, Seattle would be looking really, really good right now for the 2 pick. And, yeah, maybe the saving grace of all this might be that last week of the year where if Minnesota and San Francisco's draft playoff spot is considered, they might rest players. And if Minnesota rests guys, that could be a Chicago win. And if San Francisco rests guys, maybe Arizona can win. Cliff Kingsbury, I don't know if he's going to last beyond this season. So that might be a motivated thing for him. So the next couple of weeks are going to be really interesting. My gut is Seattle probably ends up with the 4th pick. Ideally, if you want one of those defensive guys, you want to be in the top 3. But there might be trade-ups. There might be a lot changing. But, yeah, there's a lot on the line. So I think more than as much as I'm focused on the Denver pick, like you said, I'm really focused on where the Seattle pick lands, the native Seattle pick. Because Green Bay is now 1 game back of them. they're in a playoff race. They have potential to go 3-0, but even if they go 2-1, they're going to pass Seattle. Cleveland has a lighter schedule. Jacksonville's playing for the division. New Orleans, and a bunch of these teams play each other. Like Arizona plays Atlanta, New Orleans plays Carolina. That Seattle pick could end up like 10, 11. If you can get like 4 and 11, like Seattle hasn't a pick higher than 11 before last year in years. So if you end up with like 4 and 11, like this is going to be a really fun draft season. I know there are people focused on the playoffs. For me, like I could not care less if Seattle won a game. I think that's ludicrous to want them to go play San Francisco, or you don't want to play Philadelphia. Even if they upset someone, they'll just get embarrassed. So I'm really focused on where the teams around the native Seattle pick. I think that's a fascinating thing because, yeah, we're all going to talk about quarterbacks and Jalen Carter. That next pick, which could be pick 11 or 12, that gives you so many different possibilities of what you can do there, whether that's like finding a defensive lineman with Anthony Richardson or something like that. I think that pick is sneaky, has potential to get close to 10 with all the 6-win teams out there. And Seattle goes 0-3, and some of the other things happen. This could be a really, really good stretch for them moving into next year.
The one thing that works for Seattle, Jeff, in terms of the draft position, and I'll share the Tankathon page because I don't think everybody's aware of this. But if the Seahawks end up in a tie, if they have the same record as a lot of these teams, the one thing that's going to work in Seattle's favor, you can see they're currently 15th in the draft order, but is their strength of schedule. The Seahawks have had a far easier schedule than most of the teams in the NFL. I mean, look at it compared to, so Seattle's is 0.456, Green Bay's is 0.550, Pittsburgh 5.36, Cleveland by Houston 5.08. Jacksonville, you have to go all the way to Vegas at number 10 to find a strength of schedule that has been weaker. And, Carolina's and Atlanta's is weaker because they're in the NFC South. So Seattle's, if they end up with the same record as the Packers, the Steelers, the Cleveland Browns, the Jaguars, or even Vegas, depending on who they've got left to play, they'll be ahead of all of those teams because of their strength of schedule. Because if you have the easier strength of schedule, that's what determines the draft order if you've got the same record. So that is going to potentially shift Seattle right up this board if there are a lot of teams in this sort of 7-win range. That's going to be interesting. Seattle does have, for me, a very favourable final 2 home games. But that said, and I want to sort of briefly talk about the home record. I mean, in terms of the playoffs, I don't want to get in the playoffs, Jeff. I have no interest. I think draft position is more important. I don't want to see us lose it for a third time to the Niners, and it probably will be the Niners if they finish with the 7th seed, because the Eagles will be number 1, San Fran will be number 2, I think ahead of the Vikings eventually, and it means you play the Niners. But I can see a pathway to it happening, Jeff, because obviously you've got the Giants who are going to be 6, and then it's going to come down to the Lions, I think perhaps more than the Commanders, perhaps. And the Lions have got to play the Panthers on the road, should win, but you never know. They've got to play the Bears at home, and they've got to end with the Packers who are in the playoff hunt themselves, still at 6 and 8. I don't know. I mean, if Seattle wins 2 of 3 and beats the Jets and the Rams at home, and a few weeks ago most people would have predicted Seattle to win those 2 final games, then at 9 and 8, they may well squeeze in there. We will see. I'm not that interested in that, though. I'm not. I'm a bit like you. I'm not really that interested in it. There's a few things that I want to finish on in the last 10 minutes. I wanted to show you this. So I find this. Someone brought this to my attention today, Jeff. I don't know if you've seen this. This is the PFF rankings for the safety position in the whole of the NFL. Ryan Neal is the top graded safety in the entire league. Ryan Neal, just ahead of Minka Fitzpatrick. And you can see there's Kyle Hamilton, the first round pick at 4, Antoine Winfield Jr. is at 5, Tyrann Mathieu at 6, Derwin James is down at 11. Minka Fitzpatrick, I think most people would say, oh, what a player. Well, Ryan Neal with almost as many defensive snaps. He's had 60 fewer snaps. Is ahead of Ryan Neal, is ahead of Minka Fitzpatrick as the top safety in the NFL. So, Jeff, how the hell can they justify paying Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams $36 million next year when Ryan Neal is the top graded safety in the entire league?
Yeah, the Quandre Diggs thing is the story that no one's talking about, and really it should be. I found it a little strange that he signed here, given what I thought the season would be. And yeah, a lot of people forget he's coming off pretty serious injury in week 18 last year, but he has not played. He's played poorly, and like the dropped interceptions and the missed tackle, like that dropped interception arguably cost them a chance at the game last week, and they would have probably lost anyway. But the missed tackles and looking bigger picture, I don't know what their defensive scheme is going to be next year. But now that they've gone to more of this too high safety stuff, I don't think you need these like high end talented safeties. I think you need just competent, like a Ryan Neal is a great example of. You just need someone who can be competent in the run, who can do their job in coverage. And I would, if I'm playing a too high defense, I am not paying big money to a safety. And the way the contract's set up, I think Seattle kind of gave themselves some outs, and I'd be moving on from Quandre. His age, his decline in play, and just the number itself. To me, the number itself makes the decision easy. The fact that you can get Ryan Neal to give you that kind of, I think that's a little high. He should not be the highest grade safety in the league, but the fact that he's in there and we're having that conversation is really telling. And I think it would be absolutely insane to bring Quandre back at that number based on how he's played this year. He's really taken a drop off in play. I don't know how much of it is the injury or confidence or his age kind of getting him, but for me, he's the starting point, because you can walk away like with a normal cut or even a June 1st cut, and you can clear out, I think, close to $10 million right there. And Ryan Neal, I believe you can bring him back. And Jamal Adams, I think you have to be looking at redoing his contract. If you're going to bring back, I would probably be looking at walking away. If the player can't stay on the field, it's just, you can't pay him that kind of money. And I understand what the team was thinking. They're going to have a rookie quarterback. They can afford to take that risk. And I don't know what defensive scheme they're going to be running next year, but if they're running the Vic Fangio too high stuff, to me, to put huge money into safety is a giant, giant mistake. And Quandre's play, like, again, everybody really likes Quandre. It was great to re-sign. He's been such a good player in the program. He's been really good. They got him for nothing. But, yeah, it's a thing nobody wants to talk about. I know some people do, but he's had a horrible year. And to see his number jump to 18 million, to me, that's just, it'd be a massive mistake on the cap. It'd be a massive mistake in personnel. And you can replace him probably with a 3rd-round pick or first free agent. And you talk about, I think Pete was talking about this on the air a few weeks ago. I think someone was asking him why safeties don't get paid in free agency. He said, because there's so many people who can do it. And I think it was on the Brock and Salk show. And I think they need to take their own advice there. They've put way too much resources into that position, and the return has been a joke. And Ryan Neal's been their best safety over there this season. So to me, it's an obvious no-brainer to walk from Quandre and probably walk from Jamal. But I don't know if you're going to keep one of them. I think you got to rip up their contract. I would walk away from both. I don't think you can have a 30-year-old plus making over $10 million and Jamal, who's been healthy in 0 of 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, the comment that you mentioned, Jeff, about Pete Carroll essentially saying, "Why don't safeties get paid?" Well, because there's loads of guys. You don't really need to do it. I was like, "What am I listening to here? You sound like a guy who had Jamal Adams and traded him away, not the guy who traded for him and then paid him $18 million a year." I mean, that was crazy. That answer made no sense to me, and I would have loved them to follow up and go, "Well, with respect, Pete, can you tell us what you're doing paying Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams then? Because how can you say that and then give that answer?" People are sort of wondering, what's it going to cost to get rid of these guys? And I know that we've talked about it on prior streams. You can do it. I mean, look, there are ways out of the contracts, but you have to be willing to take stuff on the chin. So here's Quandre Diggs' contract. So if you were to trade him before June the 1st, you would take an $8.2 million dead cap hit. Now, the Seahawks are absolute world leaders in collecting dead cap money, so that would be no change for them. but they would save nearly $10 million. They'd be $9.9 million they save. That $10 million could help you keep Geno Smith. Or it can help you keep Geno Smith and go and sign someone for your defensive line. So I still think, look, to get out the contract, you're better off having the 9.9 million and just replacing Quandre Diggs with a draft pick than you are to carry on paying him, because his play has been very poor this year. I'm sorry to say, it has been poor. If you do him as a post, what they did with, sorry, that's the trade. But I was looking at the trade section, but it's the same for release. So if you cut him or trade him, he's not going to have any trade value. If you cut him, then it's going to cost you. You're going to cost the same thing. What you could do is you do what with Carlos Dunlap. And remember, they paid Carlos Dunlap and released him a year later. They didn't pay him a contract like Quandre Diggs, but they did what we were proposing here, which is to release him 1 year after an extension. If they were to release him after June 1st, and you can designate 2 players as post-June 1st cuts, so you could do this with Diggs and Adams if you wanted to. But if you were to do this with Quandre Diggs, you would take on only $4.1 million of dead cap hit this year, but $4.1 million would go to the 2024 cap, when Seattle actually does have a lot of cap money available for 2024. So that makes it more manageable. And you save $14 million next year, which is definitely worth having. So I would suggest there is absolutely no way, when you've got $14 million being dangled in front of you there's no way they're going to keep Quandre Diggs on that contract. That is, he just cannot be kept. His play has not been good enough. I think he's looked disinterested at times this year as well, and his tackling's been dreadful, and he hasn't made the interceptions. So I don't think there's any chance of him being here next year. Jamal Adams is slightly different because obviously he's been injured, and they've invested so much in him in terms of draft picks. Can you just walk away from that? Look, they aren't going to cut him outright because it would cost them $21.3 million. I mean, that's how ridiculous that contract is. There is no out there. You ain't paying $21.3 million for him to play somewhere else. You would actually lose $3 million for him to go and play somewhere else. He hasn't. The trade situation is the same, and he would have no trade value anyway. The reworking his contract, as Jeff says, is one option, and maybe they could do that. But the post June 1st release, you would essentially take on $7.1 million of dead cap hit this 2023. And you would save $11 million. So by cutting Diggs and Adams, you could pretty much have enough to keep Geno Smith alone, and you'd still have your 20-30 million or whatever they've got in effective cap space to improve the roster. So I do think it does make some sense. But then in 2024, you're paying $14.2 million for Jamal Adams to play somewhere else, which is the issue, I guess. But I think if you are serious, you have to acknowledge that it's time to move on. I think both Jamal Adams and the Seahawks need a fresh start. And if the Seahawks cut him as a post June 1st and said, we're going to save $11 million or whatever it is, and then we're going to take on a $14 million dead cap hit the following year, so be it. Just get out of the contract, move on, draw a line under it. He's become a meme. So let's just move on from that. And then, Ryan Neal and a draft pick for me is a perfectly fine safety tandem. Keep Ryan Neal. And I think he's a restricted free agent, I think. Jeff's saying yeah, so he must be. So then you can keep him relatively cheaply, and someone like J.L. Skinner, who's an absolute force at Boise State, would be a good draft pick to have there. So last couple of topics, just going to block the spam that's coming into the live chat before people start having a heart attack. And if you have any sort of last super chats, get them in, because we are going to wrap up very shortly. So there's 2 things I wanted to finish with, Jeff. Firstly, this is we've kind of talked about this in the past. So, whether or not it's worth it.
You're on mute, Rob.
Sorry. It's the play at Lumen Field that I want to talk to you briefly about. And I don't know if there's much more we can get into with this. And I don't know if there's any answer to it. I think it's hard. I think anyone's talking about it. If you take out the 2020 season, where they had no fans in the stadium, there was no fans in the stadium, so every game was in front of no fans. They went 7-1 that year with no fans in Lumen Field. Take out that season though. The Seahawks are 16-15 since 2018 with fans in their stadium. Seattle has a reputation for being a difficult place to play. If they lose to the Jets, they'll have a 500 record in the last 4 years at home. That's incredible, Jeff. That is, I think, another reason why Pete Carroll probably is thinking, I don't know if I've got it in me anymore to keep this going. They're not a good home team. They are not a good home team. They're 3-4 this year at home, and they're 16-15 with fans in that stadium since 2018. That's appalling.
Yeah, I think that comes down to their defense. And one of the things that crowd did was make it so hard to time snap counts and have a defensive line that helped get them off the ball. I know Averill and Bennett talked about how good it was to rush in that stadium. And you look at, this has been our pet peeve for a long time now. They have not handled it. They haven't had a good defensive line since the Sheldon Richardson season. And you look at, like, Frank Clark had a good year in 2018, but since then they've had that whole thing with Clowney, and they had to trade for Carlos Dunlap, and then last year they had the Irvin Mayo thing, which was a disaster, and then this year their defensive line is probably the worst in the league. And one of the things that stadium does for you is it enhances your pass rushing, and they've been a bad pass rushing team for years, and I think they've taken away their own strength. And again, I think that's a knock on Pete and John and how they built this team. And with the Holmgren years, it was a different league back then where the other teams had trouble with false starts, and I think teams have just gone better at, like, signaling and the coaching and the scheme, and things have gone better where some of the home field advantages across the league has changed. There isn't a huge home field. It's with the way, like, offenses are called now, but I think it just, the Seattle's had bad defensive personnel for a number of years now. And other than that stretch at the end of 2020 where they did beat the Rams at home and they did show some good signs, they've been mostly underwhelming to bad. We've seen things multiple years where they've been one of the worst defensive in NFL history. And I think that's a big part of why they've been so bad at home. They haven't been able to, when they have a good defense at home, it's really, really hard place to play with the sound and the speed and the way they can get off the ball there with that noise. But now it's just gone. This year, like, their pass rush is terrible. And, like, Derek Carr was standing back there. You see how different he is when he gets rushed. And some of the other guys they've played, like, that's what they had. That's what made them so good. And that is a knock on Pete Carroll and how they built this team. And that's why this draft coming up is so important, because they need to basically start from scratch on the defensive line. They basically have to rebuild that entire room. They wasted picks on Collier, and they had bad free agent signings. And now they're left barren, where Al Woods is their best defensive lineman. And no disrespect to Al Woods. He's been a really good player for them. But you look at the team they just played, who they have on their defensive line, and you look at our team, and it's Al Woods and Shelby Harris, who are good rotational players. But I think that's a big reason why the home field advantage has disappeared. They've been bad on defense, and frankly, their personnel is set up to only be a good passing team. Their best two players are wide receivers. And you see it again this year. Their best two players are wide receivers. And the last couple of years, their best defensive players were safeties, and that's where their money's gone. And that's not a team that travels well. That's not a team that you fear playing, and it's not a team that they're almost a finesse team, which goes against everything Pete Carroll wants, and it's why teams don't fear coming to Seattle anymore. And their home field advantage, rightfully so, has dissipated. And until they build a team, when they got here, I did interviews with them when I wrote a story on them. They want to be like the Steelers and the Ravens of the past decade, of like the 2000s. And their first drafts reflected that. But since then, they've lost their way. And we've talked about it for years. We don't need to revisit that topic. And I think it's correlated directly with their bad home field play.
Yeah, just become a team that kicks people's arse up front. Just set that as a target in the trenches. And if you do that, and they don't win games, I'm more inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. If you can win up front, and I think Geno Smith has shown that if you put a good D line and O line out there, and with the weapons they've got, that they can cause some issues to opponents. But you've got to be able to win. They're not winning enough. They're losing every battle up front in every game. They have done since Munich. It was alarming to be in Germany and watch that game live and just see how easily they got their arse kicked up front. To see the Tampa Bay guards sort of looking at the sideline doing this, saying, "Give me another run play. I want to kick these guys again." And sitting there thinking, "Oh, this is, this." We were hearing going into that game that the Tampa Bay O-line's not playing very well, and here they are screaming at the sideline saying, "Run the ball, run the ball, run the ball." The O-line, because they think they've got Seattle's number, and they did. And that's just been every week since then. The opponent has had Seattle's number, O-line and D-line. And that's not good enough. And it's why I'm one of the reasons why I'm ready to see some changes, to see some different ideas and approaches, because I just don't want to watch that anymore. They've been very finesse for a few years now. And I think that's probably why Pete Carroll, again, is thinking maybe it's time for a change. I wanted to, so I was going to ask you about something else, but I've decided to go a different route here, Jeff, because I want to finish with this. I think it's going to be the defining topic of the offseason until a decision is made at quarterback with Geno Smith and to a lesser extent Drew Lock. The whole, do you draft a quarterback early? Do you draft a defensive lineman early? I'm already sort of, Seahawks Twitter loves to split itself into teams, and you have to be on one side or the other. And we're already seeing the draft D-line crew. We're then seeing the draft QB crew. They're sort of preparing themselves Game of Thrones style for a war, which is going to play out between January and April. And I'm a lot more laid. I think I'm a lot more laid back about it. I think if John Schneider loves a quarterback in this draft, and I don't know if he does not, then I think it's his prerogative to take one and to think, okay, it's a rare opportunity to pick in the top 5. And if he thinks he sees the next Mahomes or Josh Allen, he should probably take them, because that's who wouldn't want that? He wouldn't want the next Mahomes or Josh Allen. But then at the same time, if they pass on the quarterbacks and take a defensive lineman because they think that defensive lineman can be their stud up front, I'm fine with that as well. I would not complain with either decision, frankly. So I don't really know why everyone's going to war about it, but I obviously they are. I think if they do end up picking 4th overall, Jeff, they'll probably need somebody to trade up into the top 3 in order to get one of those defensive linemen. I think Carter and Anderson are the only 2 that I could say are worth taking in the top 5. Miles Murphy is a complete mirage for me. I've watched every game he's played this year. He's a pussycat. He's an athletic pussycat. Brian Brissy is a great athlete, but he's never put it together. He's had a knee injury, kidney illness, strep throat. There's always something, I'm afraid. And I feel very sorry for what happened with him this year. It's obviously a horrible. The death of his sister meant he missed more games as well, and you can't knock him for that. But the injuries and the illnesses have kept him off the field. Tyree Wilson has got some good play, but and I love his length and his size. But you're really going to take him in the top 5. So Anderson's got potential. I still don't think he's a Bosa type. I think and I'm a bit worried that he's just going to end up being the next Maffei, or especially if Carroll's still here, Maffei Taylor type who gets lost in the wash as a 245-pound outside linebacker. I think Jalen Carter's got a lot of potential. He's been fantastic on the stretch. But then you've got Todd McShay coming out and saying, just beware, there's a few character issues there. And you never know what that means. So, if it is 4th overall, what are they going to do? Because if Chicago take Carter and then Arizona take Anderson, what are you left with? You trade down at that point? I mean, I don't know. And if teams haven't traded into 2 or 3, why are they going to trade into 4? I guess it's a conundrum, really, Jeff. And look, I think there's a chance that someone like Chicago could trade down, because the Bears fans are screaming in blue murder for an offensive line, but there ain't an offensive lineman worth taking at 2. So if they get a hold, they trade down and say, look, it's a 2-year project. We'll go down to 15 or whatever and go and get our offensive tackle or whatever to and placate the fans a little bit and get some stock, and somebody else goes up for the quarterback. But then, sorry, and this is a long-winded point, but a year ago, everyone was saying, oh, look at the Eagles. They've got another pick for next year because they might want a quarterback, but now they don't need one. And it's like, well, all of these teams are positioning themselves for this great quarterback class, but people are not talking about that anymore. No one's talking about the going up for a quarterback, are they? There's no real buzz. People kind of just put Bryce Young number 1 overall by default. People have soured on CJ Stroud. We had all this about CJ Stroud for 12 months, and now everyone's like, actually, yeah, not sure. Will Levis is not, people say Will Levis had a bad year. Good luck to CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, or anybody else playing behind that crap offensive line. for Kentucky and the SEC. And then, Anthony Richardson has had like about 12 starts in college football. So, it's there were sort of clear top 5 picks. But what the Seahawks do there, I think it's going to be a big debate. But I think really it's where they pick that's going to shape what they do. Because if the 4 and the top defensive linemen are gone, they might end up taking a quarterback just because that's the best value at that spot if they like one of them. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's why you said it so well. I'm so focused on where they end up, and it's really going to dictate. But I'm like you. I really don't have a strong take on this because I find it really weird that there's a crew already coming out and saying they need to take a quarterback because this draft has good quarterback prospects. Number one, that's an absurdly simplistic take. And I've seen smart people say it. Drafting a quarterback is not like drafting a defensive tackle. You got to dive deep into their personality. You got to know whether they can take over a room. Like, there is a lot of evaluation. Just because the media says some guy's a good quarterback prospect, that doesn't mean – like, if you remember how Justin Herbert was talked about and Josh Allen, those guys were kind of laughed at by a lot of the media. And they were like – when the Bills took Josh Allen, a lot of the analytics community was like kind of ripping into them. And Justin Herbert was like the second to Tua. Like, that was the second consolation prize. So drafting a quarterback is not like – and C.J. Stroud, like, I think you were one of the first I read that was a little skeptical of him. And there's a lot of things there that make you a little worried. And I was listening to Ben Solak with The Ringer, and he was doing a podcast. And the comparison he made for C.J. Stroud was Jared Goff. And I think it's a pretty good comparison where when things are working, everything's clean, he looks like a pretty good quarterback. He's not the best athlete. He's not the most – he doesn't create a lot out of himself. But when things get ugly, and we saw it in some of those Michigan games, especially this year, doesn't look great. And the opportunity cost, say you're passing on a guy at a different position, you really like to take Jared Goff. Like, just because the media says he's a top 5 quarterback, are you comfortable doing that? There's a huge opportunity cost. So I'm like, I don't have a strong take. If you're sitting number 3 and Jalen Carter's in there, I probably want to take him. But I think the NFL is going to really like Will Levis. I think once they go through the process, once they go through who the next group of prospects are after that top 3 guys, and yeah, Will Anderson is a really good pass rusher, but you look at how they're just getting killed up front. I don't know if Will Anderson is the guy that's going to really solve a lot of this team's issues. They need guys that can win in the trenches. And Will Anderson's a good finesse pass rusher, but he's not the TJ Watt, Max Crosby, Aiden Hutchinson type that could kind of dominate run and pass. He's more of the pure pass rusher, which will help Seattle. They had a lot of issues on third down, but they really need people that are going to win up front. They could kind of be like those war daddy players. So I don't see Miles Murphy as that. I'm with you. I see a lot of Clemson's players have come in and they've had these high draft picks. Farrell a couple years ago. There was all these kind of guys. They have a type, and a lot of those guys haven't hit in the NFL. And a lot of their players, like, I think I would be weary of him as the 5th pick. But Tyree Wilson is a guy that we're gonna have to learn about. I don't know if he's more of like the Jermaine Johnson kind of prospect, or he's a guy who can win in all 3 downs. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting if they end up, say, 5 and those top 4 guys are gone. Like, I can see Schneider loving Will Levis, and he's a guy I think is going to gain a lot of steam as this draft process goes along. And the good thing about Levis is he's a guy you could pair with Geno Smith because he might not be ready to play, and you can kind of transition them together. But for me, like, it's hard to see, like, this defense that just has no frontline talent. Like, the opportunity cost of not getting, like, a defensive player to build around to me is really tricky. Because even if you do get the quarterback, like, how do you fix this defense? How do you time that out? Because you want to have a defense ready to go with that young quarterback. So I don't want to keep pushing this quarterback away. But, man, like, they need a building block on defense because Jordan Brooks has not played particularly well. I know his tackle numbers are good. Darrell Taylor took a massive step back. We're talking about cutting the safeties. Who are you left with? Tariq Woolen, and that's really it. So
that's it.
That's you need to build the whole entire front 7 basically, and these kind of defensive line prospects rarely come around. So that's my gut. But if they I think this, I don't know who's going to be coaching this team, but I think Will Levis is a guy that we need to keep our eye on. He was the guy that a lot of us thought would go number one. Their team had a bad year, but that doesn't mean he's a bad prospect. You put him with a better offensive line, and Seattle has some pieces there on the offensive line. They need to get a lot better in the interior, but the skill guys that they're going to have in Seattle, the running back, that's a really good situation to walk into. So he's a guy that interests me. I'm not sold on CJ Stroud, but I think the people that are coming out with these strong takes, they need to do this and need to do that. I think that's absurd. Taking quarterback is Carson Wentz and Jared Goff and Marcus Mariota and Jameis Winston. Those were highly graded guys by the media. You pass on a really good defensive player for one of those guys, that might set you back for years. So I'm not coming back and going after positional value, but they have a lot of work to do in the trenches, and I want to see them address it this year. And if a quarterback's there, then great. If you can have one of those guys that's going to compete with Allen and Burrow and one of those guys, then you're going to be a good team for a while. So I'm open to both sides. I think they just got to get this right, because if they waste this opportunity with all this draft capital, this could get ugly for a while. Because you look at the defense and what's there, it could be that 10, 12th pick team for a while that isn't bad enough, it isn't good enough, and you don't want to be in that area. It's the worst place to be in the NFL.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, but the thing is, though, is like someone's put in the comment section, we need a guy like Nick Bosa. I always think when people say stuff like that, you might as well say we need a guy like Patrick Mahomes. It's very hard to get those players. Just go and get a Bosa, just go and get a Myles Garrett. They're rare. They're incredibly rare. You can run through, like the Raiders were hoping that Cleveland Ferrell was going to be that, in top 5. There's a whole bunch of defensive linemen who were drafted very early who don't become Nick Bosa and Myles Garrett. So it's very difficult to find a franchise pass rusher just as much as it is to find a franchise quarterback. So that's just sort of one thing. But this is the unique thing about this draft. I think Will Levis will end up going first overall, Jeff, because I think that, like you say, what will happen is, and it'll be debated like crazy, and Twitter will hate the pick, but he is big, strong, athletic, good arm, great character. There's a lot of things there that a team can say, we can justify this to an owner who wants to know who I'm spending this first pick on. And he gets compared to Justin Herbert and Josh Allen all the time. So, people are looking for that player, and he fits the bill the most. So I think he will probably go first overall. Jalen Carter, this is the funny thing about Jalen Carter, is if you were to say to me, he's exactly what the Seahawks need. They need somebody who can, destroy the interior and sort of do it, down to down. And, that's a real issue that they don't have somebody like that. I think we may have just lost Jeff, but we're going to wrap up in a second anyway. So I'll just finish this thought. With Carter, you've got to do that, but you actually look at the stats that Carter has. So you watch the tape and you see impact play, pressure, destruction up the middle. And you look at the stats and you see very little to get excited about. And then you sort of compare it to Quinnen Williams, who had that sort of impactful final season for Alabama. But then when it actually came down to, the production, it was there as well. That's what Carter doesn't have. His stat line's unusually small for a player who has been so impactful. So it makes you think again, and then there's character talk with Todd McShay and stuff like that. So you don't know. But I think, look, if you love one of the quarterbacks, you can justify taking them. And if you don't, then you've got the defensive lineman as well. We have officially lost Jeff, so we will call it a day there. Big thank you to Jeff for joining us on this live stream. Thank you to everybody who has been here. Good numbers for this. SeahawksDraftBlog.com for more analysis. A reminder, please do like the video and leave a comment. Give us a general thought. Even if you've joined in the live chat, give us a general thought in the comment section. Helps promote the video. Please subscribe. Still half of you are watching the videos but not subscribing. So if you haven't subscribed yet, give it a little subscribe. Helps promote the channel. And have a great Christmas. Have a great Christmas, everybody. We will be here for a live stream right after the game against the Kansas City Chiefs. And what better way would you want to spend your final hours before Christmas Day than listening to me? And I think Adam's definitely going to join us. I'm not sure about Robbie complaining about a Seahawks loss, which is probably what it's going to be against the Kansas City Chiefs. But you never know. Maybe they'll surprise everybody. We will find out on Christmas Eve. So until then, enjoy final Christmas week. See you on Christmas Eve. Until then, bye for now.